45 years. It's been 45 years since China and Australia established diplomatic relations. Since then, things, well, they've changed a lot.
Modern China was founded in 1949 with these words: Zhongguo Renmen Zanqi Lai. The Chinese people have stood up. It was an assertion of sovereignty. It was an assertion of pride. And we stand up. And so we say, Adalia Renmen Zanqi Lai. The Australian people stand up.
Through all these years, both countries have maintained one of the most fruitful, controversial, and interesting relationships in the world. A relationship based on stories about money, spies, accusations, infidelities, and many, many conflicting interests. Because, in all honesty, if we're talking about a relationship between two people instead of two countries, we'd have a great script for a Latin American telenovela. But obviously, this is visual politics, so let's get right to the point, shall we? Today, China is Australia's main commercial partner. Their purchases represent about a third of all Australian exports, 8 times more than exports to the United States. See, in 2015, China and Australia signed a free trade agreement, and today their trade relations exceed $155 billion per year. And not only that, China is also becoming an incredibly important investor in Australia, a country where 1 in 20 people are Chinese, among them many millionaires who decided to find a safer place with more guarantees for their assets and their lives.
Such is the scale of trade that financial markets have long been of the view that the Australian dollar is one of the best proxies for bets on China itself. James Lawrenson, Deputy Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute.
Of course, this all has its consequences. We already talked about it here on Visualpolitik. Australia has broken records and has not had a national crisis for almost 30 years. Sounds pretty amazing, right? Well, the Great Chinese Takeoff had a lot to do with all of this success. Therefore, it's easy to understand why, when the Lowy Institute, an important think tank in the country, asked Australians last year which relationship was more important to them, the one with the United States or the one with China, and the result, well, it was a tie. This is despite the fact that relations with their North American friends are very close indeed. However, in spite of this romance, the fact is that 2017 was not a year of love for Australia and China. Check out what Bob Carr, former Minister for Foreign Affairs of Australia, said on the subject.
This year, Australia declared rhetorical war on China. The words being used by Australian leaders are the harshest any time since diplomatic relations commenced in 1972, with the exception of comments at the time of the Tiananmen crackdown. The tone is harsher than that of any other US ally, including Japan.
As you can see, 2017 was a very difficult year for both countries' relations. So much so that a survey by the Global Times, one of China's most popular newspapers, determined that Australia was the most hostile country to China in 2017. And the truth is that with Trump in the White House, those are really big words.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
So what the hell has happened? What has led to so much dissension between Canberra and Beijing? Well, let's have a look at that, shall we?
The storm.
At first, 2017 seemed like it'd be a good year for China and Australia. Economic relations wouldn't stop growing, Trump showing off his best diplomatic skills, hung up on the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull himself, further sinking his popularity in this area of the world.
We had a good telephone call. We had a great call.
And the Australian government even publicly supported China replacing the United States as a main member of the failed TPP, the Pacific Free Trade Agreement. We could almost say that, in telenovela terms, love was about to triumph. However, the good times didn't last long, and everything started to go wrong about halfway through the year, and it went really wrong. Yes, they have had clashes before, but nothing really major. In recent years, the Australian government has followed a strategy that basically consisted of trying to balance their position between Beijing and Washington. In economic matters, it was all Beijing, and in security and defense matters, it was all Washington. We already mentioned on VisualPolitik that Republicans consider Australia to be the US's best ally. And so it should be. Australia is the only country that has intervened in every major US war, and for years their military relations have been so tight that Australia has become the US's spearhead in this area of the world. The Australian Prime Minister himself has shown his great appreciation for the United States, saying,
"The peace and stability of our region has been enabled by consistent U.S. global leadership. While that leadership would not have been possible without the hard power of fleets and armies, its greatest potency has come from the values which it embodies. Through all the twists and turns of history, the United States has stood for the values on which its great republic was founded: freedom, democracy, and the rule of law." Malcolm Turnbull.
But let's get back to the Chinese matter. See, these words were pronounced on June the 2nd, 2017. That was the first time an Australian Prime Minister spoke so clearly in favour of Washington in a speech which was also full of warnings to China.
Such a dark view of our future would see China isolating those who stand in opposition to or are not aligned with its interests.
And then, just 8 days later, the media storm broke out.
ASIO says espionage and foreign interference against Australian interests is extensive.
Several news organisations reported on a single story. The Australian Intelligence Agency was making very serious warnings about the Chinese government's intentions to influence Australian politics through various means, including purchasing politicians, journalists and scientists, or the surveillance and intimidation of citizens belonging to the Chinese community in Australia. The scandal, well, it was unleashed. Suddenly, news started to emerge on the collaboration of Australian universities and scientists with Chinese military contractors or former politicians, such as the former Trade Minister Andrew Robb, who now works for companies controlled by the Chinese government in exchange for juicy salaries that amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And of course, the Australian Security Service's fear of Chinese espionage certainly isn't new. Various Australian governments have been blocking Chinese corporate operations for years, and have also banned companies such as Huawei from participating in deploying a national broadband network. This is all precisely because of a fear of espionage or excessive Chinese influence. However, despite everything, controversy and tension had never gone this far.
Media reports have suggested that the Chinese Communist Party has been working to covertly interfere with our media, our universities, and even the decisions of elected representatives right here in this building, in the Parliament. Malcolm Turnbull.
On December the 12th, 2017, Sam Dastyari, Labour Party senator and one of the most promising political figures in the country, was forced to resign because of his ties to China.
I said earlier in this statement that I am a patriotic Australian. I meant that with all my heart, and I leave the Senate with nothing but good thoughts for our country and for our people.
Among other things, he was accused of receiving money in exchange for speeches that favoured the Chinese government's interests, and even of alerting a Chinese businessman linked to the Communist Party that he could be being investigated by Australia's intelligence agencies and that his phone could be tapped. Well, scientists collaborating with Chinese military contractors, university infiltration, paying journalists, buying politicians. These accusations had been running since the beginning of June. The Australian government denounced it publicly and began modifying its legislation on espionage, treason, immigration, and on financing political parties. And this, dear viewer, it looks like it's only just the beginning.
It is no secret that China is very active in intelligence activities directed against us.
The consequences of these cooling political relations can be seen, for example, in foreign policy. We can clearly say that in 2017, Australia has been favouring the United States like never before. But don't think that this position has been unanimous among the political class. Not at all, in fact.
The government doesn't seem to understand the economic importance of the relationship with China or the strategic issues involved. We're putting all of our faith in our relationship with China through the foreign policy lens of the US. Paul Keating, Australian former Prime Minister.
And you know what? Given the circumstances, I think that this entire debate on the position Australia should take regarding China is quite understandable. On the one hand, many critics affirm that there isn't enough evidence of the Chinese interference that the government denounces. Some even say that this is all a political operation fed by Washington. Now, on the other hand, breaking with China, or at least being this forceful with the Beijing government, isn't exactly easy for Australia. And now you might be asking, well, why is this? Well, check this out.
China defends itself.
Throughout this entire political crisis, China has been very strong. Of course, they have denied all accusations and have even said that this entire campaign is based on racial prejudice and anti-Chinese paranoia. This paranoia, they have claimed, is turning into clear hostility towards the Chinese community in Australia itself.
Chinese diplomats warn students in Australia to stay alert to safety risks after spate of attacks.
Yes, these types of messages may seem exaggerated, especially because the truth is that beyond a few posters in one university or another, there seems to be no evidence of this acclaimed danger. But although this claim shows us how things are, it's also kind of a warning, because clearly it isn't good publicity. Allow me to explain myself here. Chinese students account for 4 out of every 10 foreign students in Australian universities, and they spend $18 billion in the country every single year. It seems that Xi Jinping's government wants to make it very clear that it is willing, if necessary, to play in economic terms as a pressure measure. This is something that, by the way, they have used recently with both South Korea and Taiwan. And we aren't only talking about students here, but also about tourists and investors. For example, in recent years, the luxury sector has experienced a huge economic boom in Australia. And you know why? Well, listen to this.
Students, tourists, and Chinese residents in Australia are responsible for up to 2/3 of all luxury retail sales in Sydney and Melbourne.
And how about another example? China's direct investments in Australia have multiplied not by 10, not by 20, but by 32 in just 9 years. So as you can see, slowing down this entire process could translate into a lot. And that is a lot of pain for the Australian economy. But, dear viewer, that is simply the way things are. So far, the Australian government remains faithful to its close relationship with Washington. The United States seems to have secured an alliance that is essential for their interests in this area of the world. And for their military industry, in recent years, Australia became one of the US's best customers. And in the next decade, they expect to spend more than $100 billion renewing their armed forces, where American contractors have a big advantage. However, there are more than a few people, and by people here I mean politicians, businessmen, and citizens, who ask Australia to remain neutral and protect its national security without having to make so many public accusations. So now the question becomes, well, how is this story going to end? Will one of the most fruitful relationships in recent years be at risk? Well, only time is going to tell. But now it's your turn. Where do you think Australian politics should turn? Do leave us your answer in the comments below, as well as in this survey. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do hit that like button below, and do not forget to subscribe to this channel for brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.
And so we say, Adalia Runman Zanchi Lai, the Australian people stand up.
It is no secret that China is very active in intelligence activities directed against us.